Hi there everyone. This is the 4.02 video for the Cold War at home and abroad. The end of World War II had not ended the threat of war. With the spread of communism and the fear that grew around it, the United States faced challenges in China and war in Korea. President Truman sent troops commanded by Douglas MacArthur to Korea and continued his policy of containment elsewhere. As the 1950s continued, the fear of communism at home brought persecutions led by the demagoguery of Wisconsin Senator Joseph McCarthy and a second Red Scare that was greater than the first. Goals for this lesson: recognize the U.S. response to the threat of communism in China and Korea, identify major causes, leaders, events, and results of the Korean War, and describe the second Red Scare and McCarthyism and their impact on the nation. Don't forget to go to lesson resources and grab your reading guide and or lesson answer key. And let's begin. We're going to read pages 759 through 766. So, starting with the Cold War heats up. In 1949, American officials received some deeply disturbing news. Spy planes had discovered the Soviet Union had tested an atomic bomb in the desert region of Kazakhstan. The United States no longer had a monopoly on nuclear weapons, a monopoly that Americans had thought of as the ultimate check against Russian aggression. Scientists advised a worried Truman that they could develop a super bomb, 1,000 times more powerful than the weapon that destroyed Hiroshima. Can the Russians do it? The president asked. When told that they could, the president responded, "In that case, we have no choice. We'll go ahead." Thus began the arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union. So the arms race was also another characteristic of the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. The communists in China. In 1949, China, Asia's most populous country, came under communist control. For decades, the country had been torn by fighting among various factions. Since the early 1930s, this fighting had boiled down to a grueling civil war between the Kuomintang, also known as the Nationalist Party, and the Chinese Communists. The Nationalists, led by Chiang Kai-shek, ruled China and received more than $1 billion in aid and supplies from the United States during World War II. But the nationalist government, while pro-Western, was also inept and plagued by corruption. In October 1949, the communists, led by Mao Zedong, gained control of China. Chiang Kai-shek and his fellow nationalists were forced to retreat into exile on the island of Taiwan, then called Formosa by Westerners. The United States recognized the nationalist government in Taiwan as a legitimate government of China and would not establish formal diplomatic relations with mainland China for decades. In Beijing, China's capital, a triumphant Mao stood atop a high gate and spoke to a cheering crowd. He announced the birth of a new communist nation, the People's Republic of China. With Mao's victory in China, the communist world roughly tripled in population. Mao soon traveled to Moscow to conclude an alliance with Joseph Stalin. Many Americans blame the Truman administration for losing China. Conservative Republicans attacked Truman for failing to stand up to communist aggression in Asia. Even some Democrats agreed. The young Congressman John F. Kennedy referred to the tragic story of China, whose freedom we fought to preserve in World War II. What our young men had saved, our diplomats and our president had frittered away. Okay, going on. Conflict in Korea. Let's look at the picture here first. Two U.S. Army artillerymen fire a howitzer against communist positions in the mountains of Korea in 1951. So that's when we're into the Korean War. And look at the map here, stages in the Korean conflict. There's the inset there showing where Korea is in Asia, and then the close-up position here we have North Korea in pink, South Korea in the blue, and showing the lines of advancing and armistice and in the Korean Peninsula. Okay, here we go. Conflict in Korea. The criticism of Truman for losing China was unfair. Without risking another large-scale war, the United States could have done little to prevent Mao's victory over a corrupt and incompetent Chinese government. But those who worried about Soviet-sponsored aggression in Asia would soon be proven correct by events in the Korean Peninsula. Like Germany, after World War II, the former Japanese colony of Korea had been divided by the victorious Allies. The Soviets occupied the north above the 38th parallel of latitude, and the Americans controlled the south. By late 1940s, the Soviets had installed a communist dictatorship in North Korea, while the United States supported an elected but authoritarian government in South Korea. Both regimes claimed to be the legitimate government of the whole peninsula. By 1949, both the Soviet Union and the United States had withdrawn their occupying forces from the Korean peninsula. In June 1950, with Stalin's encouragement, the North Korean dictator Kim Il-sung ordered some 90,000 troops to invade South Korea. A shocked Truman declared, "The attack upon Korea makes it plain beyond all doubt that communism has passed beyond the use of subversion to conquer independent nations. It will now use armed invasions and war." Truman ordered American troops stationed in occupied Japan to come to the aid of South Korean forces. He decided to do it so without asking Congress for a formal declaration of war. He saw America's military response as a necessary police action to contain the spread of communism. Truman also turned to the United Nations for help. The UN agreed to send a multinational force to Korea and to place these troops under the direction of the brilliant and egotistical General Douglas MacArthur. 16 nations sent a small number of troops, but the war remained largely an American effort. At first, the war went badly for the United States. Within 2 months, the North Koreans had conquered most of the South. Communist troops drove the UN forces and their South Korean allies into the far southeastern corner of the peninsula. Then General MacArthur executed a daring plan. He caught the North Koreans completely by surprise with a massive amphibious landing in the port of Incheon, Aicheon, far beyond enemy lines. From there, the troops marched inland, quickly recapturing the South Korean capital of Seoul. The North Koreans were forced to retreat into their own territory. MacArthur pursued them, now determined with Truman's blessing to destroy the North Korean army on its own turf. MacArthur's troops drove all the way up to the Korean peninsula to the Ural River, North Korea's border with China. But the general was unaware that Mao Zedong had decided to come to the aid of the Korean communists. In November 1950, close to 300,000 Chinese troops poured across the Yalu River to the sound of blaring bugles. In what American soldiers bitterly nicknamed Operation Bug Out, the overwhelmed UN troops retreated under ferocious Chinese fire and through the snows of a freezing Korean winter back into the South Korean territory. MacArthur now called for an attack on China itself and even proposed dropping atomic bombs on Chinese cities. But Truman was far from ready to go to war with China, let alone resort to nuclear weapons. Always more concerned with Soviet designs on Europe, he was willing to negotiate an end to the fighting and return to the pre-war boundary of the 38th parallel. The fighting in Korea turned into a long, bloody stalemate. MacArthur sent a letter to Republican congressmen who read the letter in Congress. In the letter, MacArthur criticized Truman's policy of limited war and said there is no substitute for victory. The president fired him for insubordination. Truman was happy to be rid of the overbearing general he called Mr. Prima Donna, Brass Hat, Five-Star MacArthur. But conservative Republican politicians rallied to the general's defense. They accused Truman of being soft on communist Chinese. Some called for impeachment. On his return to the United States, MacArthur received a hero's welcome, complete with ticker-tape parades. He was invited to address Congress, where he concluded his speech by recalling a song that said, "Old soldiers never die, they just fade away." MacArthur said that he himself would now just fade away, an old soldier who tried to do his duty as God gave him to see that duty. When Truman heard MacArthur's emotional speech, the president reacted with an obscenity. Don't you love those little personal jabs they inflict on each other? After long negotiations, the conflict in Korea ended with a ceasefire agreement signed in July 1953. The agreement established a narrow demilitarized zone, called a DMZ, extending along the 38th parallel, which military troops were forbidden to enter. Neither side won. Some 33,000 Americans died in the fighting. The South Koreans suffered more than 600,000 military casualties, dead, wounded, and missing, and North Koreans and Chinese at least 1.5 million. Exact counts of civilian casualties are unavailable, but respected sources report that more than 3 million dead or missing and millions left homeless. By fighting in Korea, the United States had affirmed that it would stand up to the spread of communism. But in this case, the conflict ended with the communist regime intact and a tense and uneasy peace in a divided country. And let's go back here to read the inset on this page about desegregating the military. In World War II, African Americans in the military had mostly performed menial labor, but in the Korean War, they were among the troops on the front lines of battle. In part, this was due to President Truman's efforts to desegregate the armed forces. In 1948, Truman signed a presidential directive, Executive Order 9981, stating, "It is hereby declared to be the policy of the President that there shall be equality of treatment and opportunity for all persons in the armed forces without regard to race, color, religion, or national origin." High military officials resisted the President's order, and decades would pass before it was fully implemented. And here we see a desegregated armed unit on the front lines of a battle in Korea. Okay, continuing to another Red Scare. In March 1947, in response to accusations that he was soft on communists, President Truman ordered that all government employees undergo background checks to ensure their loyalty to the United States. The investigations revealed little espionage, but a few hundred employees lost their jobs because of suspicions about their loyalty. Elsewhere around the nation, some state and local governments, universities, and businesses required employees to sign oaths affirming their loyalty to the United States. A refusal to sign could mean losing one's job. As the Cold War intensified, widespread fears of communism inspired a Red Scare that for a time infected American politics with a witch hunt mentality and curtailed civil liberties in the United States. The HUAC. In 1938, Congress formed the House Un-American Activities Committee, HUAC, to investigate fascist and communist elements that might try to subvert American society. In 1947, in the midst of Cold War anxieties, the committee turned its attention almost exclusively to individuals and groups it suspected of being communist sympathizers. The HUAC closely examined the movie industry, both because of its broad influence on the public and because of the left-wing ideas of many actors and screenwriters led to widespread rumors of communist activity in Hollywood. One member of HUAC called Hollywood the greatest hotbed of subversive activities in the United States. In the fall of 1947, the committee began televised hearings on communist influence in the film industry. 10 of the witnesses called by the committee, most of them screenwriters, refused to answer when asked, "Are you now, or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party?" The witnesses cited their right to freedom of speech under the First Amendment. Indeed, membership in the Communist Party was not and had never been illegal in the United States. Nevertheless, all of the so-called Hollywood 10 were convicted of contempt of Congress and eventually sentenced to prison terms up to 1 year. Studio executives intimidated by HUAC compiled blacklists, lists naming people whose loyalty was suspect or who participated in left-wing activities that HUAC associated with communism. Those whose names appeared on the blacklist could not get work in the entertainment industry. After HUAC's Hollywood hearings, producers and directors shied away from scripts that might be seen critical of American society, such as The Best Years of Our Lives, a 1946 film about the difficulties 3 servicemen faced trying to adjust to civilian life after they returned from World War II. Rather than risk accusations of disloyalty, filmmakers found it safer to make movies offering a blandly positive view of life in the United States. The Alger Hiss case. HUAC also investigated charges of spying by Soviet agents. In 1948, Whittaker Chambers, a journalist who had spied for the Soviets before renouncing communism in the late 1930s, appeared before the committee. He named several others as Soviet spies, including Alger Hiss, a highly respected liberal lawyer who had held high State Department posts during the New Deal. And here's a picture of Alger Hiss taking oath before the House Un-American Activities Committee. Many government officials, including Secretary of State Dean Acheson and President Truman himself, rallied to Hiss's defense. But one HUAC member, Richard Nixon, then a freshman Republican congressman from California, harbored a deep suspicion of Hiss and pressed the case against him. Nixon's suspicions seemed vindicated when Chambers led reporters to his Maryland farm and showed them a hollowed-out pumpkin containing microfilm copies of secret government documents, which Chambers claimed Hiss had delivered to him when both men were Soviet spies. The discovery of these so-called pumpkin papers led a grand jury to indict Hiss for espionage in 1948. His alleged offense, passing secret documents to the Soviet Union, took place 10 years earlier in 1938. This 10-year gap exceeded the statute of limitations, the legal limit on the maximum amount of time that can pass between an event and the initiation of legal proceedings based on that event. The statute of limitations for espionage is 3 years. In other words, legal proceedings against individuals charged with espionage must begin within 3 years of the alleged crime. Alger Hiss's lawyer successfully argued that too much time had passed for Hiss to receive a fair trial. Although Hiss could not be tried for espionage, in 1950 he was convicted of perjury for lying about his connection with Chambers. Hiss served 44 months and a 5-year sentence. For decades afterwards, the Hiss case would rouse political passions, with most conservatives insisting that he had been rightly convicted, and liberals tending to argue that he had been framed by Chambers. The grand jury, we'll read this in the next video. We'll stop this one now.